we're live. That's right, everybody, live. Thank you so much. I'm Carl Hooker, your host today, an educational consultant and author speaker from Austin, Texas. And I want to welcome you to this exciting web event, Unlocking Cyber Safety, Protecting Education in the Digital Age. Lots of different topics we can go to with this, and with AI entering the mix, it makes it a lot more complex. But before I introduce our guests, a couple quick housekeeping items. This webinar is being recorded. Of course, it's being posted also live right now on LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. So if you guys want to interact, those of you that are watching at home, feel free to interact in the comment sections of those platforms. We do want to involve you as much as we can, but know that this is a 30-minute presentation, so we're going to try to get through it as quick as we can, but also have an opportunity for you guys to comment if you see or have a conversation that you want to be a part of. And then the only other thing is I want to mention a couple other things. Again, before I introduce our folks up onto the stage here, I do want to give a quick shout out to our friends over at Microsoft. Again, thank you for sponsoring these conversations we've had over the last several months. Of course, Cyber Safety Month was just last month, but still having those conversations now. And I think that's an important thing to talk about as we get into the show. So without further ado, I'm going to invite up Chris Stegg. He's going to be our first one we're going to talk about. Hey, Chris, tell us hello, what do you do for a living besides that beautiful Lorax tree behind you?
Hello, folks. Happy holidays. I'm the CTO at a Microsoft partner called eGroup Enabling Tech. I've been doing that for 17 years. Passionate about things like AI, security, and the user experience.
And without further ado, we also have someone who has not a virtual background. That is a real background. That's Dr. Joe Phillips. Joe, tell us what you do for a living.
Thanks, Carl. Good to see you, Chris. So I'm the Chief Information Officer for Broward County Public Schools here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. So it's the 6th largest school district in the country. We have about 260,000 students. So, and like Chris said, I'm all about cybersecurity, AI, and how we can make a difference in the lives of students.
I love it. Yeah. Having a little district like Broward in here gives us some weight, I think. 6th largest. That is amazing. Hey, Matt, joining us from YouTube. Thank you for jumping in as well. Let's get right to it. So, over the last couple of years, we've seen, an increase of applications. Of course, COVID really accelerated that, having all these free or freemium applications we could grab. And now AI is kind of entering the fray, more new things that we can get a part of and be a part of. Just a real easy question to start. How do you manage all of that data? Joe, you want to start on this one?
Yeah, sure. Happy to start. So for us, it actually starts before we even get through the selection process on these applications. So we first have to make sure that we're going to be abided by FERPA, COPA, SIPA, HIPAA, if that's involved with anything medical. And then we have a very robust process here that we send it up through our cybersecurity team as well as our privacy team to make sure that we're going to be in compliance. And vendors have to agree to our terms and conditions before we'll even go through the procurement or finish the procurement process for these applications. The other thing that we do is we make sure that our schools and our departments know what we've already pre-approved for applications and what those applications do. So one of the most famous things I think that we see in K12 and probably other industries is somebody will go to a conference and now they want this new tool because they feel like it can solve some problem of practice for them, which it can, but we might already have solutions that are solving that problem of practice. And I think what we saw with COVID especially was a lot of new ESSER money hit the scene. A lot of new applications started to pop up. And what we're doing really is distilling those down and saying, okay, well, what problems of practice are those actually solving for our district? Because we don't need 30 applications to do anti-bullying campaigns and that kind of thing. So where's our biggest return on investment and how can we really consolidate this? And that really helps us with making sure that we're keeping our student data and staff data safe and secure in places that we can trust, that we can maintain that access and that responsibility over the data before we even start using the applications. And then we have lots of layers of protections that we'll put in once we get those applications into use as well.
Yeah, and it's, as you're talking about the cyber, like the cyberbullying things or whatever, whatever it is, there's always, I feel like we already have a lot of these applications in place sometimes, but then we see the new shiny and we get excited and we add it and like, wait a minute, this one's already kind of providing that service for us and we've already vetted it. Chris, you're working with schools kind of all over, but you also partner with Microsoft. How do you address that kind of this new kind of bump of influx? Because, 10 years ago, you did have a few applications, but now it just seems like they're infinite in some ways.
It's easier said than done, but I like the idea of Joe's standardization. And with the Microsoft stack, you get that secure back end, no matter what front end of their tooling you're using. I think the challenge is most teachers don't think of Microsoft first, and they think of things like Power Apps or the many things you can do in Teams inside of a classroom setting now that Microsoft's put a lot of money into. So I'd say in general, IT leaders should be making sure that their users are coming to them and that they're thinking of Microsoft first. If you already own the A3 or the A5, you have these tools with a secure backend, that there's a security substrate underneath it all that's common and relatively easier to manage than all of these point solutions.
Right. Having that single source or that single place, like you said, that sub layer, I think is so important.
And I want to mention to Joe and others that inside the Microsoft tooling, there is a list of thousands of third-party SaaS apps that you can peruse, and it will show you their impression of their secure score. So it'll tell you if they're FERPA, HIPAA, if they have a BAA. This tool exists inside of a product called Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps. It's their CASB. And if you have one license for that, you can cruise this whole list, and that may help shortcut some of that evaluation.
Have you,
I love that,
Joe?
Yeah, I literally wrote it down as you were so,
Yeah.
We're good, Carl.
Yeah, I was thinking as Chris was talking, and you were saying, Joe, about all the apps, it would be nice to have that repository. And it sounds like Microsoft's already kind of done some of the legwork for us, which is nice, which gets us to kind of this next question. And I think, so one thing is, of course, making sure we're vetting the apps and making sure our data is kind of protected in there. Then there's this whole idea of like, what's going to happen with our identities that are existing in these apps and existing in our own infrastructure. I hear this term fish proof all the time, right? It's fish proof, which, by the way, the number one reason why education industries get hacked, 92% of those attacks are phishing attacks. So, how do we make an actual fish proof identity? Is this really a thing, Chris? Is that just a fancy term, or can it actually happen? Or can we just use MFA? And then we're done with it.
I think we can be honest that what's fish proof today won't be fish proof tomorrow. A year ago, all we were talking about was multi-factor because there was such a drum that needed to be beaten to implement just minimally viable security. And that's your first step. However, these days there are MFA fatigue, and there's even ways in which an adversary in the middle attacks can spoof an MFA and steal an identity and allow an bad actor through. What we're now stepping up to is another layer in the decision process to allow a login attempt to succeed. And that is by checking the device and the device compliance. If the device is known by the organization and managed, in the Microsoft parlance, of course, that's Intune, then it's another check in the zero trust sequence to say, we trust this login. You don't omit the MFA, you still prompt for MFA in situations where it's warranted. But also, if you know the device, it's much more likely that it's a teacher or an administrator coming from their Windows device than it is from some bad actor on a Unix machine in North Korea who's stolen an identity.
Yeah. And Joe, what are you doing in your field? I'm sure how many teachers are you dealing with too, by the way?
Yeah. So we have roughly 15,000 teachers in Broward. So we have about 35,000 staff altogether. So, and then MFA and phishing is very interesting here. In a K12, you can't really just kill all the traffic you would in some other industries. We have parents here in Broward. We have people from all over the globe that are trying to contact folks inside the district for legitimate needs. And then during different times of the year, we'll have people traveling all over the world to include our students. So it becomes very tricky for us to try to make sure that we're creating the most robust layers of security that we can. And while MFA is really, really good, and to keep cyber insurance, pretty much everybody had to implement MFA. For some of us, really quickly, it became a challenge when it came to our students. So not even all of our students have email accounts. How do we get the MFA? Do we use tokens and that kind of thing? And then we're also a bring your own device district partially. So, I really like the idea that Chris talked about, and we're working on getting to become a one-to-one district and having those devices actually assigned to those students and those staff members, and being able to make sure that the device can also count as that something you have for that multi-factor, that it becomes much more robust. But it can be a challenge. And even with MFA, we've had staff members here that have literally through phishing attack gone in and added the bad actor's cell phone to their MFA so that those text numbers could go to that, and they were still able to get in. So I think to Chris's point, we can constantly be working towards that vision of fish proof, and it can be until the next thing happens, or we'll always have that human element that they'll be able to exploit to get around.
Right. And you add that layer of, so now you've got, how many students do you have, Joe? I was just curious, the sixth largest district, how many does it have?
Yeah, so we have roughly 260,000 K-12 students, and we have about another 100,000 college students at our 3 tech colleges.
That's wow. And thinking about all the students, all the staff you mentioned, all the travel, all the devices, some of which are yours, some of which are not yours. And then you add, actually, I kind of skipped ahead there a little bit. I wanted to think about this too. So the idea that there's extra fields of communication now taking place, because I'm thinking about my own kids personally. Last night, my 10-year-old came up to me and said, "Oh, Dad, I have a friend." And I'm like, "A friend where?" So a friend on Roblox that I'm, communicating with. And I'm like, okay, so now the apps have built-in communication, which to me, again, 10 years ago, you're worried about email, and that was pretty much it. Text messaging later, but now there's all these different areas of attack. How does this all affect our systems? So Joe, do you want to hit that one first?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. And I think third-party messaging apps are one of the biggest challenges right now for phishing. It can be another vector to get them for phishing, but also for when we really talk about and shift to cyber safety and not just cyber security, it's one of the places that our students and our teachers can be the most vulnerable when we're talking about what information is being shared through those third-party apps. Photos, videos, that type of content, as well as student records that can be created, stored, and shared inside of these apps. And one thing that we have found is we needed to really hone in what we allow in terms of these third-party apps. So instead of just blocking them, we're choosing which one we're going to go with as a district, make sure that we have a data sharing agreement with them, and then that is where we're directing our students and staff to use for that messaging. That allows us to archive everything. Here in the state of Florida, we have what we call Sunshine, and we have to be able to produce all of those messages and retain them anyway. But those messages can very quickly become an actual student record under FERPA, depending on what's being talked about between teachers and students and parents and students. And so making sure that we're kind of moving past the freemium versions of things where we can actually have back-end administrative access. We can actually give out user accounts if we can get SSO set up with Microsoft or another vendor, making sure that we have all of those layers of protection in place so that we can actually use it appropriately.
Yeah, that's such an important point to mention. We see free, we get excited, we want to use it. But what's happening to all that data, all that conversations, all that the archiving, I didn't even think about until you just mentioned it, Joe. To be honest, I'm used to archiving my email, as a district leader. But now I have to think about this too, because you're right. There's sensitive data that's being interchanged in there as well. Chris, do you see what are you seeing in terms of the complexity of these communications that are now on all these third-party apps, and the work that you do as a company to kind of help bridge all that?
Yeah, I like the whole response by Joe quite a bit. He's obviously got his eyes wide open to all the factors. I'll come at this quite simply and just double down on his suggestion to enable SSO to all of those apps, because the data is the crown jewel, obviously. How do they get to the data? They have to have access. And to get access, the identity is the front door. And so simplifying the identity management across all these third parties with SSO through Entra ID or Okta or the like will give you the ability to at least have one single point and not to omit or forget the administrative tasks to enable the MFA or to disable the user when they terminate. These are all things that should be in one's place by this point. And if you're mature and advancing, you should also think about having your HRIS or your SIS feed the directory so that there's one single point of truth governing all of the HR and identity combos. And SSO is the best way to get that done on the outside.
Yeah. And so you mentioned that single sign-on process. And I think, again, I keep going back to years ago when it was, spreadsheets and uploads and downloads and 24, at midnight, they'll come and do the refresh and all that. So provisioning accounts, that used to be a pretty lengthy process. Well, now we have also complexity of more applications. So, and then also rights within those provisions. Like, how do we manage all of that? So best practices on provisioning, Joe, any thoughts on that? I mean, you've got so many accounts to deal with and so many different layers, depending on, are they high school students? Are they teachers? You have college students too that you're dealing with as well.
Yeah, it can get really complex. So first, it's to always try to go to role-based account provisioning when we can for the RBAC or role-based access control. And step 2 is to automate every part of it that you can for the provisioning, but most importantly for the deprovisioning of those accounts. So getting the roles hashed out, making sure that those roles are standardized. So in a district as large as ours, we have little chunks of duties as example. So one school might have a secretary that's doing attendance, one might have a registrar. And so inside of our HRIS, they might have 2 different job titles, but we had to really get down to those chunks of duties so that we can make sure as we're provisioning through our student information system or our ERP or some of these other systems, that those chunks of duties are actually getting coded and provisioned appropriately. And then as the HRIS shows those people moving jobs or roles or leaving the system, that automatic deprovisioning is really happening. Then making sure we have, strong password protocols, things like resetting every 60 days and that kind of stuff. But to Chris's point, integration with our ERP and our HRIS systems are huge. And then making sure we call it our 360 provisioning. So for our LMS Canvas, we're making sure that everything is coming out of our HRIS and our SIS into these different systems. And so we only have one source of truth for each different account type, all the way back to what we call kind of the kernel or the nugget of those accounts. And then they spread out from there. But we wanted all of that to be as automated as possible.
Yeah, and that's easier said than done. You have to have a scripting guru to get that all done right. And there's admittedly Active Directory and Entra ID and the like aren't natively set up to do joins, movers, and leaves perfectly. So Microsoft has another SKU called Identity Governance, and it's being built to meet those more complicated needs. And it's interesting, Joe, you said in K12 you have movers. I was thinking it was much more applicable in higher ed, where a student becomes a TA and then an alumnus. Those are really prevalent in higher ed, but I see your point in K12. I think for the meanwhile, the key thing goes back to SSO. If you at least have one source of your identity and you turn it off, then if you forget to decommission the account over in the payroll app that they have access to, or into the third-party service that you've purchased for the classroom, so what? It's not like they're still abusing or using those. Yes, a purge of those is necessary over time, but at least to get that first step done that day is most important.
Yeah, thinking about all the entry points, I know I had 10 campuses and different people on each campus, registrars, like you mentioned, Joe, kind of doing that entry. If that data is not very clean, it really messes everything up, right? And so anything you can automate, taking almost the human element out of it, the more the better. I remember vividly trying to find data point. I was like, why is this? Oh, because someone had moved something or put a space after something, just a little thing that threw off all my data. And that's just a big mess. Oh, this is an interesting question for Matt. Actually, do you see a difference in strategies for small district versus larger? He's got over 15,000 students. Of course, Joe, you've got a lot more than that. And again, some of this you can have a person that's dedicated. I know, data governance, having a position is just kind of overseeing that. Joe, I'm sure you've got people in your department that do that, but smaller ones, how do they manage that too? Any advice?
Yeah. And actually, I think that's a great question. So Broward's my 4th district, and I kind of scaled up through. So my first district had about 11,000 students, and I went to about 16 and then 60, and then where I'm at with Broward. I'm going to kind of go back to what Chris said with using those third-party applications the best that you can. So I'll have staff that can do certain work and that kind of thing, but finding partners that can build out your scripts or your automation if needed, and then leveraging kind of the lesser amount of resources that you'll have in those smaller districts. And I definitely know that struggle of just not having those resources. So it's really about making that maximum impact with the limited resources. And in a district like Broward, I got resources, but then I have different issues and that kind of thing. But, my first district, we had one cybersecurity person, and we were lucky to get that. That was after my 3rd year, was able to get one that could do some threat hunting and do some provisioning. So I had to actually rely on my systems engineers to be able to do the scripting for our account provisioning and that kind of thing. And then we had to bring in some really good partners that would help us actually develop and implement those types of things. So yeah, best advice I have is really don't get away from the best standards or the industry practices or best practices, but figure out kind of how you can leverage your resources to make sure that you're still meeting those standards.
And you got to thanks there, Matt. That's good. Yeah. And again, Chris, you kind of work a lot with this, helping districts with this too, kind of having those, I'm thinking of districts here in Texas, there's 1,000 districts in Texas, but half of them have less than 500 students. So they don't have, like what Joe was talking about earlier, you have maybe the one person who's doing everything and they're driving the bus and coaching the football team. So, all of this data now, helping those smaller districts, how do you help with that?
Well, I think for an organization like Joe's, it is a different ball game. I think for smaller organizations, you have to think minimally viable security. And the three key components of minimally viable security for anyone these days is a good identity strategy. We've talked a lot about that being the front door. You have to know where your devices are and who's using what. A configuration or at least a hardware database is a must. And last but not least, you have to have a automated endpoint detection and response service. Don't rely on 5-year-old AV, because 0 days and signature-based updates to any software like that are passé, and you will be caught. And that's the three things that anybody should budget for in 2025.
Yeah, and I think eventually it's going to happen to all of us. Hopefully not, but I know I talked to you guys a couple of days ago about this. A friend of mine who had a couple of pretty bad attacks happen to him, and I think everyone's hope is it'll never happen. But let's go to worst case scenario here. And I hate to bring this up, but we got to talk about it because I think it's important to have it front of mind too in your work. Let's say you've had that data breach, and it's happening. What happens next? And I think it's also important to point out that these data breaches affect more than just our learning applications, HVAC, everything else. Joe, you could probably talk a little bit about that because you've been in a lot of different places. I'm sure you've seen either in your own shop or in shops near you, like where something like this has happened. So what does that look like? What's your crisis response look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it was my 93rd day at Kansas City Public Schools where we got hit with a cyber attack, and it took everything down. So our HVAC, our SIS, we couldn't take attendance. We couldn't run our buses. We couldn't feed our kids. We couldn't get them in the classroom. Couldn't take attendance. We couldn't use our visitor management. We didn't have internet. And some of our water fountains wouldn't even work. So we got hit extremely hard. And at that point in time, we had no business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response. None of that had been set up. There was a cyber audit that happened the year before I got there, but none of the remediations had happened. So just completely unprepared for what happened with that. So in that type of situation where you don't have anything, if you have cyber insurance, that can be your first call. And that's what we ended up doing in Kansas City. Was fortunately, we had gotten cyber insurance and we made that call first. And then they got the remediation team in. They took up care of the PR. They started working. They negotiated with the attackers and all of that kind of stuff. So that fortunately we had the insurance and we're able to do that. The remediation team came in. We actually ended up with 2 remediation teams. One to kind of get us back up and running, and one to work the actual attack vector and clean all of that up. It took us 18 months to fully recover.
Wow.
Some of our servers never came back up. So my first call is always to cyber insurance, unless you're self-insured, and then you got to call yourself. So the best thing to always do is prevent it as much as possible, but you can't live in this world where it's not going to happen. That's not a form of protection, just thinking it won't happen to you. So my first step, and we've gotten attacked since I've been at Broward, we've been able to remediate very, very quickly, is to Chris's point, make sure that you have that endpoint detection response, you have your network detection response, you have these tools that are going to alert you and help you really get in, stop the bleeding first. And then it becomes about, okay, how do we keep the business running? And then how do we put in our disaster recovery steps? And if you haven't already, you need to get that business continuity and the disaster recovery teams formed now and start getting those steps planned out, because the worst time to figure it out is in the middle of it. And so get your tabletops, practice. In the Army, we have a saying that the worst plan well rehearsed is better than the best plan never rehearsed at all.
I love it.
And so that's what it's all about with cybersecurity. And then it's just a matter of, you should already have your prioritization of systems and just start getting them back online in that priority until you can get back to school. Hopefully it doesn't take you out like it did when I was in Kansas City, but you just want to get back up and running as soon as possible.
Yeah. 3 days, my buddy's district was down. The kids couldn't come to school. Like you're saying, buses, transportation, everything. We practice, tornado drills. We practice, all the lockdown drills and things like that. But, actually having a plan in place, like you're saying, get together around the table before, because inevitably it'll happen. And then you're like, okay, now what do we do? But if you practice it a few times, at least you have that idea in the back of your mind. Chris, are you working with schools? Do you see them doing this commonly, or is this fairly rare? I mean, I figure a school Joe's size is going to have to do it because they're just massive, but a lot of the smaller schools are probably thinking, oh, it's not going to happen to us.
Right. And you're probably not a direct target. Like Joe probably loses sleep over being the 6th largest, but you are being targeted by the automated scanning tools that any 17-year-old in Russia is setting out towards the world to see what will happen. So they will find any vulnerabilities in that space. And so I like what Joe said about a tabletop exercise. After, of course, you've had the time to work with your team on a plan, an incident response plan. And one key point there that we see a lot, and I'd imagine Joe faced this in KC, was the administrators are often not part of the incident response plan. And that's a problem because they need to know what their role is, and they need to know who and when they should be asking questions of. Because I remember Joe in that series of events was pretty frazzled, but he probably had 17 things to do. And then on top of it, you had all the administrators going, can we open the doors? Are we safe? Will they get water? And you have to have a plan that they're involved with so that there's a liaison between the commander, folks like Joe or his direct reports, and the rest of the folks in the business or in the school system that have to know. And there's a legitimate reason they have to know and they want to know, but they'll get in your way if they don't have a way to get a succinct and stepwise update.
Yeah, and I'm sharing a link down there at the bottom. And of course, we'll share these out too after the show's over to those of you that are registered. So your 7 steps for successful incident response tabletop exercise, it says it right there in the link. So I appreciate you sharing that too from the eGroup site. You mentioned, Joe, you said cyber insurance, and I think, people out there listening, cyber insurance is tougher and tougher these days. So kind of quickly, what thoughts, cyber insurance versus self-insurance? I mean, we did both, and inevitably we lost a lot. We're going through the challenges of getting through cyber insurance and just device insurance too, which is a whole nother topic. So we end up self-insuring, but what are your thoughts? Kind of, obviously, it's nice to have insurance when these things happen, but what's the reality look like?
Yeah. So my main thought is, if you can get it, get it. It's getting tougher and tougher to get, and the insurance companies are making the cost benefit analysis, and as tax rise in K12, they're just kind of saying no, thank you. And for a couple of years, I had a kind of a hit list of 50 things that I could do that could almost guarantee that a K12 could get approved for cyber insurance. So, turning on MFA, making sure your RDPs are off, and just kind of these cyber hygiene things that we could make sure that we did. But even that now, it's become, you can be outrageously quote unquote secure, and they still might not touch you just because of the cost benefit. And so if you can't get third-party insurance, then you really need to make sure that you got something to cover you. But most importantly for me, the insurance needs to be a few things. One, the payout, if you need to pay a ransom or something like that, is good. Paying to recover anything is good. But honestly, the biggest value that came to me from cyber insurance was they had the methodology to follow and the supports to come in when their attack actually happened. And so if you're not able to get that from that company, you need to make sure that you're building those out for yourself and your district. So I think that's all I can say about that.
Yeah, that's Chris. Any follow-up thoughts on that? I mean, I feel like if you can get it, it's great.
I would agree. And the rigor that you will have to follow to get it is obviously a big step towards zero trust, which is where everybody wants to be. The expense to do so is a blocker in many organizations because it's a long list, 30 plus. I've seen a list now from our insurer that was about 60 questions. And it's not just, do you have MFA like it was 2 years ago? It's, do you have MFA on servers, VPNs, remote email, computers, you name it. They're covering the gamut, which is good, because the day that you checked MFA, the one box, and they found a way through without MFA in a very vital system, you're uninsured anyway. So it's important to follow that. The fact of the matter is, though, that's expensive. And I heard a CIO refer to his self-insurance set aside as a war chest. That's what it is. And that's about how much you have to be thinking about, in millions, to do this right. So yes, get it if you can. But either way, take the steps to try to protect yourself so that you don't need it. And if you don't get it, have a breach coach. Joe mentioned the cyber insurance companies have the folks that they'll bring in that guide you through the forensics and the process to restore. But that's something that if you're not well practiced in your incident response plan, you're going to want to have a breach coach, someone that you can call and get quick help to guide you through that.
New positions that didn't exist, 10 years ago. Threat hunters, I've heard breach coaches now. All you kids out there listening, that's future in cybersecurity for you. So final parting shots, guys. We're at the half hour, and I want to make sure you guys have a chance to kind of give a kind of a 1 minute walk-off shot here. And again, we've covered a lot in just this 30 minutes about all the different complexities of our systems, multi-user accounts, different devices entering our school systems. So what's your final word of wisdom out there? And we talked about cyber insurance, all of that too. Chris, I'll let you go first. Joe, we'll let you do the closeout.
Well, I hate to put more pressure on people with this, but I think before any district or organization starts to think seriously about leveraging artificial intelligence, they should get these minimally viable security controls in place and practice, because AI makes it easier to find data than it was before, because through a simple large language, common open-ended search, stuff is just going to show up in the index of the searcher. That makes it easy for an attacker, or for your people, an insider threat mentality, to find stuff than it was before. And so we didn't at all mention today data protections, but permissioning on your SharePoint sites, keeping people from sharing every file with everyone, as is the sort of global standard these days. That's the kind of stuff you need to start pinching to prepare for any AI initiatives. Joe?
Yeah, well, Chris didn't leave me much. I agree with everything that Chris just said. The only thing I think I could add is, especially in K12, it's making sure that we're going beyond cybersecurity into the realm of cyber safety. We need to make sure that our kids are also safe when they're using the technology. So that includes a lot of the AI that is coming. So to Chris's point, we need to make sure that we have all of those protections in place before we journey out into that realm, which is why here at Broward, we've not allowed things like ChatGPT for our students yet, because we're working to get all of these different types of protections in place before we will really allow that to be pushed out. Not that they're not using it on their home computers or that kind of thing, but there's a lot of things to get in place. And then with AI, I'll just also say, leverage your AI defense tools the best you can as well. So whether that's XDR, we're doing a preview of Copilot coming up to kind of see what that can do for us. And really AI, especially for those smaller districts, but even a district like Broward, it can really take on a lot of the staff that you don't have to be able to help with those protections. And so I have threat hunters, I have cyber defenders and all of that, but they're human. And they can only handle so much. So the AI is tremendously powerful in making sure that we're detecting and we're responding appropriately and keeping that environment as safe as possible.
So it's an interesting double-edged sword. AI is becoming, right? So much potential it can do to help us. Ms. Carter just asked this, Dr. Joe, what's your school policy at AI at this point? You kind of just answered it, right? So you're really looking, right, to see, like, we got to vet these tools before we put them in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely vetting. And the other thing that's really important is a lot of the apps that we kind of talked about earlier, a lot of the apps we have already approved, we're having to go back and reevaluate because they're slapping AI onto them.
Yes, they are.
that can be a API back to OpenAI, or it can be, you know, something that they call AI that's really just a small ML engine or something like that. But we have to now analyze all of these. You know, where's this data going? Are you dumping our data in with several other districts that are all kind of slicing and dicing to get answers? So it's causing a lot of work to make sure that we can create this safe environment. So right now our AI policy is we're not allowing it till we get all this stuff figured out. But we also feel the pressure on the other side and all these cool tools that are coming out. And I'm a huge proponent of what AI will be able to do for K-12, but we just got to make sure we have those safety layers in place first.
Yeah, and I feel like Microsoft is right on board with that too. Copilot has been out for a while, but of course the educational version of it, they want to make sure all that data and security is in place before they start rolling it out to education, because all these other companies, like you said, they look cool, they're great, but there's always a price to pay for that. So I want to thank Joe and Chris for joining us today. You can check out more of Chris's company there at egroup-us.com. And if you haven't had a chance yet to check out the Microsoft Digital Defense Report, they released it, I think it was early November. This report's got a lot of kind of a 10,000 foot view over everything. A lot of the things we talked about today, and a lot more than just, you know, this goes beyond, so far beyond just MFA. And I feel like, you know, when AI now is introduced, we waited till the end, folks, to bring up the word AI, but it is important to talk about because that is going to add yet another fun layer of complexity to everything we do. So thank you, Joe. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to send you guys off stage for just a second. And as I wrap up again, be sure to check out, thank you to Microsoft again for hosting this. Be sure to check out their Microsoft Digital Defense Report. We are going to share a lot of the links. I know Chris shared a couple of important links. So those of you that have registered and didn't get them, if you didn't see them scrolling across the screen, if you're watching this later, you can always have access to it via the registration link, because again, I'll send that out in an email following the show. And yeah, thank you to all of us that joined us there on the YouTube and LinkedIn. I can't believe I just called it the YouTube, but I did. We went way over the 30-minute mark, but that's okay. Great conversation, everybody. And again, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation on unlocking cybersecurity, defending our schools in the digital age. It's a fun time of year for us, isn't it? Take care, everybody.